Oftentimes people want to get involved in their communities, right? And what they lack really is an understanding of where to get started. There are a lot of eager people that just want to make the world a better place, right? And they kind of intimidated by, either the alphabet soup of their local governments or the scale of problems. And what we've found is that when you create work that either demonstrates even a small sense of how a problem can be solved, it's more likely that people will feel agency around them. As we've started to pivot a lot of our work, especially around sort of democracy level engagement, we think it's really important that we instruct people on sort of how to get involved. Creating consistent solutions-based journalism and explanatory journalism that gives people a sense of how things work and how things can be better just goes hand in hand with that approach to community engagement, particularly around elections.
Hello, I'm Jessel Noor of the Solutions Journalism Network, and welcome to A Better Way to Cover Elections, campaign reporting that centers communities and solutions, organized by the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas. Throughout this course, we've explored how to integrate community engagement, transparency, and solutions into our reporting on elections and democracy. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by Christiaan Mader, the founder and editor of The Current in Lafayette, Louisiana. The Current has been highlighted for its impactful use of these strategies in its coverage. Thank you so much for being here, Christiaan.
Thanks for having me.
So in the excerpt of that video that we shared at the top of this segment, you discussed how solutions journalism can empower communities, and we'll link to that entire video in this segment. But can you elaborate on how you implemented this approach at The Current?
Yeah, I would say that we tend to think about it as if you want your community to understand what can be done, one way to do it is just to present them with the idea, right? So we view it as a kind of accountability journalism, right? If you bring a concept forward, whether that's within your community, from outside of it, it gives people an idea of how things could be different, one. Two, and two, it gives you a sense of how things actually work, right? And I think it's really important that, quality solutions journalism in particular is paired with, kind of baseline reporting about the way, especially a local government can operate, right? Sometimes as reporters, right, we get so good at understanding how these things work, right? How agencies work, how governments work. We forget that those things are not necessarily that easy or obvious to the people we're talking about. So trying to break these things down in a way that helps people understand how government impacts their lives becomes essential. And solutions journalism is actually a really good tool for that because it's fundamentally a form of journalism that looks at what's practical, right? It's a pragmatic approach. And that sort of narrative becomes something that helps people understand their government in a way that, or their government in particular, in a way that makes it practical to them.
And that's a really straightforward way of explaining this concept of solutions journalism, but it is very different than the traditional approach. And I want to ask you more about that, but first to talk a little bit more about the work you've been doing. The Current participated in the Advancing Democracy Fellowship, which is a partnership between Solutions Journalism, Trusting News, and Hearken in 2023, and produced a voter guide tailored to the needs of your community. Can you share more about how you accomplished this, particularly in identifying the most pressing issues for your readership? And I the reason I want you to talk about this is because, a lot of outlets make voter guides, but very few actually base those voter guides on exactly what their community wants to know. So I wanted to sort of, ask you to explain that in practical terms, because this is something that can have a profound impact in a news outlet's relationship with its community, especially in this big election year.
Yeah, where it started for us was actually the year before the big election year, right? So Lafayette went through a municipal election year in 2023. And in late 2022, we were thinking really hard about where we would fit in there and how we could report on it differently. And we had done some citizens agenda type work in the past, but we wanted to go a little bit further. And so we got lucky a little bit which was around the same time Lafayette was really starting to try as a community to understand a very basic problem that the state of Louisiana has and that Lafayette is no stranger to, which is we were losing younger people. A lot of folks that sort of go to college here, they exit, they leave, and they don't come back. And, that's a real problem for any community, of course. And we wanted to, of course, understand why that was. And we thought, well, if you're looking for a burning platform, I think is one way of characterizing it, a burning platform for our community or to understand where there might be energy, right, is to say, well, this is an issue everybody seems to care about, but what doesn't seem to be understood is why, right? Like, so what do we know about the main issues that might drive somebody away, right? So we asked the question. We literally posted a survey. This was before election year saying, hey, young people, why are you leaving Lafayette? We were quite frank about that. And we got a pretty interesting list of responses. And that initial survey gave birth to a series of questions that we asked over the next 6 to 12 months, which was to say, like, okay, what are the main things that seem to be problematic? And which of those things are really relevant to a local government, right? Because at some level, like the challenge here was taking what may be larger and thematic issues and distilling them into something that a reasonable person could see that their local government has an impact on, right? I want to illustrate something about this or emphasize one thing about this, which is like, it's not like any of this stuff was really all that surprising. Like if you just do some basic reporting, you know that Lafayette, like a lot of communities, struggles with housing affordability, right? And that young people might be sensitive to that, or that coming out of college, having access to a good job might be something that young people would be concerned about. Or if you live in southern Louisiana, you might not be surprised to find that flooding is something that people care a lot about, right? And my view was, well, just because it's not surprising doesn't mean it's not novel, right? You need to understand what the question is behind the question. And so it's useful to then start asking over and over and over, what's happening here? And where we took it a little further, right, was actually trying to figure out how we could connect each of those dots to local government in the mayor's race. And so that's how we built that election guide. At the end of the day, it was fundamentally about understanding how young people were viewing their government or the impact of their government if they didn't yet know that it was their government that had a role in it, and trying to use that energy, right? Understanding that these things really mattered to them to get them engaged in that election, for them to see that they had a stake in it, by pointing out where local government itself, right, had salience on each of those issues. Some of them are more obvious than others. And then beyond that, doing solutions journalism around how those topics could be addressed, right? So how could local government meaningfully affect housing affordability, right? How can local government meaningfully impact economic development? How can local government meaningfully impact flooding, right? So to me, once you kind of mapped it out that way, it made a lot of sense. But at the beginning, right, it took a little bit of just very basic hunch-driven journalism, right? Well, there's something to this problem that kids are leaving, and we should get to the bottom of that. And that really was the origin story of the whole thing.
And you've had can you talk a little bit about the impacts? Because you've had some notable impacts and some feedback. You've learned throughout this process, how, you've learned how your audience feels about this kind of reporting, and they've, so talk about what that response has been and what kind of impact and feedback you've noted throughout this process.
Well, first and foremost, surprise, surprise, if you write about things that young people care about, they read it, and so we did see a noticeable uptick in readership among younger news consumers, right? And I'm defining that as folks between, 18 and older, right? So I don't want to overstate it, but it was noticeable, and certainly more noticeable on social media platforms than it was on our web traffic, but we saw it, right? And so that's important, not just as an impact, but really just as a means of understanding whether you're resonating, right? And that's essential. Beyond that, Lafayette has since, particularly around the housing issue, I think begun to take that seriously as something that we need to deal with at a community scale. And without sort of going too deep into the background, until this point, I think, the last major mayor's election that we had was essentially premised on the flooding thing, right? Like that would be something that everybody talked about. And so I think there was a ton of demonstrated impact in seeing that the administration that's currently in office is taking it seriously as something they need to deal with, right? And until this point, it was almost treated as sort of a fringe issue. Housing is something that we don't really need to talk about. But nowadays, it's a mainstream political issue in Lafayette's discourse. And I would credit a lot of that, not just to our reporting, but the sort of the ripple effect beyond. Other news outlets began to take this up. People were talking about it. There was a sense that this was something that needed to be addressed, number one. And number two, a sense that it was something that could be addressed. You couldn't hide behind just macroeconomic forces anymore and say, like, wow, there are things that local government can do to move the needle on this in some way. And so they better wake up and do something about it.
And so that's fantastic. And was there a particular moment where you noticed this change, and especially in young readers, which is something a lot of news outlets face challenges with, because we know young people get a lot of their news from social media instead of news outlets. Was there a particular moment or a certain critical mass of reporting that you produced that where you started noticing this impact and this change?
It certainly built to a bigger swell around the election itself, right? And that shouldn't be surprising. I mean, generally, people are coming to news organizations at that time. And so where we noticed that what we were doing was starting to have resonance outside of our own channels was watching other news outlets sort of pick it up. And for those questions to start getting asked at forums, right? And not just our own, that this became a topic that was just expected. And then, once the race was over and the new administration took over, I mean, some of the first town halls they had to sort of get public input on, hey, what do we need to tackle as an administration? One of the first ones they did was on housing. And, look, in journalism, right, you always struggle to draw cause and effect connections like that. But I don't think it's a stretch to say we had a profound influence there. And I think a lot of that had to do with making it about this one constituency, like bringing it back to that citizen agenda and saying, like, why is this important? It's not just because the newsmakers say it's important. It's because this community says it's important. And if we, as the people of Lafayette, are going to put emphasis on figuring out how to better serve this one constituency, then this is something you really need to take seriously.
That's fantastic. And one thing that viewers of this MOOC will hear me say a lot is that the cool thing about solutions journalism is that it doesn't require learning new skills, but rather adopting a new mindset and a new approach as journalists. Talk about how you have applied this mindset shift in your work and the work of The Current, and what impact that's had.
I think in general, we've put an emphasis on, look, if we're going to give people a sense that the world doesn't always work, you better give them a sense of how it could be better, right? And so that's one way of looking at it, which is probably the more conventional way of considering solutions journalism. Where I think we've got a little twist on it is that I fundamentally see it as a form of accountability journalism, right? That, especially in the context of local government, and this is a conversation about elections, and so it's unavoidable that you're sort of talking about government itself, is that if you're able to demonstrate or to interrogate ideas in practice, right, then it becomes unavoidable for people in charge, right, to say, well, there's nothing that can be done about X, Y, or Z. You can't hide around sort of this smokescreen of some problems are just too big to be solved, right? So I think it's a little easier when you're working in local government because, especially in a town the size of Lafayette, which is, 120,000 people. And so we have enough resources to do something. And if they do something, you can see a meaningful change, right? It becomes even more instructive in those circumstances because, it doesn't take an act of Congress, a literal act of Congress, to make those changes. And they're not that hard to come by, right? You're operating in a world where there are literally hundreds of municipalities across the country that are facing similar issues. And so to be able to bring those concepts to bear in your own community makes the idea that doing something different is possible unavoidable, right? And so to me, it's not just about, the hope that by presenting a different face on a problem that people are more likely to come to it, but rather the sense that by presenting this world of possibility, you're holding your local leaders accountable to that world of possibility, right? I mean, and I think that's really important because at the end of the day, journalists really want to think of themselves as instruments of change and accountability. And I see solutions journalism as a real tool. And so we adopt that as a mindset in whatever we're doing. So it may not always show up in a sort of solutions profile, but it usually is lurking behind the scenes in terms of why we're approaching an issue in one way or another.
And one of the most challenging aspects in solutions reporting I've found when talking to journalists is doing exactly what you described, and what the Current has done. In the video we referenced earlier, taking a solutions approach to looking at pandemic response is specifically looking at how other communities are responding to the same challenge. And I found that newsrooms and journalists don't typically do that, and for some reason it's difficult to see the parallels and to report. I mean, a lot of local newsrooms do report in their communities, but to get over that as a concept of being able to learn from the successes and failures of other communities, how has the Current sort of overcome that barrier, and what have you learned that would be helpful for other newsrooms that want to adopt this same approach?
Yeah, I think, first, I would say that, look, the differences are something you just got to get used to owning, right? So people will say, well, that's good for Galveston, Texas. Would that work in Lafayette? And you could say, like, well, maybe not, right? Here where Galveston is different than Lafayette. That's part of the reporting, is to sort of say, here's why this thing may work or may even not work in this other place, and why it nevertheless would be relevant to a reader in Lafayette. And look, whatever you do in communications or journalism, you always have to think about whether something is relevant, right? And that's just part of the process. On the other hand, I mean, I would just sort of point out to folks who find this sort of an alien concept that, like, ideas don't just come from nowhere, right? I mean, whether you're in the legislature or you're working in local government, people are looking around to other communities already. Like, this is a natural human instinct. And I think in a lot of ways, solutions journalism, when looked at through that lens, right, when you're talking about profiling concepts that may be outside of your community, I mean, I don't know about every town that everybody lives in, but I know in Lafayette, like, our leadership go to conferences, right? Like, they go to the other places to study other models. Like, the idea of looking at models for solutions or for approaches in common problems is just something that people in government and people in leadership do all the time, right? And so I don't think we should feel all that weird about sort of looking at other communities. Yeah, there's always going to be that person that sort of says, like, well, what does this have to do with Lafayette? That's, like I said, that's Galveston. I don't want to pick it on Galveston. That's Galveston's problem, right? But I think it to me, that feels more like the outlier in terms of what actually happens when you think about what decision makers tend to do to come up with their ideas. They're usually trafficking them in conversations with their peers in other cities. This is a very common sort of thing, especially in the 21st century, where we're all sort of aware of what other communities are doing. It's all over the internet, right? So to me, maybe the experience I'm sort of speaking from here is it's never struck me as a particularly weird thing to do, right? I mean, like, I just, as a reader, enjoy reading about interesting ideas, and I think a lot of other people do too. And I think if there's a message I would send to the solutions journalism averse publisher, it's like, maybe just try it and see if your readership likes it. I bet that they will, because I bet they already are doing this on their own in some way.
Fantastic. Yeah, and absolutely. I would agree with that. And, no problem that we face as a society or as communities is unique, right? They're very universal, and every community is finding a way to cope with them. And there's going to be some positive deviance. There's going to be some communities that are doing it better than others. And those are things that we can learn from. So I think that's a fantastic way to respond to those kind of concerns. Finally, people are going to be watching this that are going to be taking this step in taking this approach, and in this election year, doing this work, and putting on a different hat, putting on a solutions hat to tackle these problems that we're all facing, whether it's housing, public safety. There's so many different issues that are going to be very consequential for this election. Talk a little bit more about the lessons you want to share with other journalists that are on this journey, and what you think they'll be able to accomplish.
First and foremost, just if you're going to take an approach where you fundamentally whether it's sort of a citizens agenda type approach or some kind of survey-based, poll-based thing, just don't stop asking, right? It's easier, I guess, to ask the one question and then kind of let that be the data set. But, our experience really found that like we had to ask the same question a bunch of different ways to capture all of that feedback. And I don't just mean, putting it on your website versus putting it in your newsletter versus putting it on social media, right? Like embedding the essential question in different places, meaning like people don't always understand, the principal citizen agenda question particularly, right? Like, what do you think is important about this election or whatever? Or what do you hope politicians might be talking about? I mean, I think you got to be clever about how to, extract what's in people's brains, because not everybody sort of speaks in that language, right? And so one thing that we found really helpful was just to constantly ask and then present the feedback, right? To say, okay, well, what's important? Okay, well, housing. Well, what is it about housing? And find different ways to engage people in that question. So that's one thing. Two, activating partners is really helpful. We had a really positive experience working with a young professional organization here to develop a forum where we did like this reverse town hall thing where we had voters on stage talking about these issues and talking about their experiences, inviting candidates in. And that was a much easier event to pull off with a local partner because, for one thing, candidates want to go where voters are. Right? And so knowing that constituency was going to be there was essential for them, and it casts a wider net and it makes it easier for people to feel like you got buy-in. And so, I also think it's really helpful to kind of set aside, the drama of the day a little bit. You're going to have to pause a couple of times and say, well, is this the most important story to our readership? Right? Is it important because it seems dramatic and consequential, or is it important because it relates to this idea that we know that they care about? And that takes a little discipline, frankly. And it will grate against some of your instincts as a reporter. Well, so-and-so said this thing that seems dramatic and terrible, right? And it's like, I'm not saying don't cover that stuff, but if you're having to make those editorial agenda setting type decisions where you're saying, well, what do we focus on? Right. Sometimes you're going to have to exercise a little bit of that faith and discipline and saying that we've set a process in place for making this happen, for making this coverage happen, and we're going to stick to it, even when this shiny object sort of appears and we think, gosh, we got to stop everything and go after it. That's really challenging. So some of this, I guess, is like be patient, right? As you build, if you were to sort of want to pair all these things together and build a voter guide, or to take that approach where you're fundamentally focusing on the most essential levers available to a voter outside of the ballot box, right? Like the actual positions that these candidates are running for, you really got to stick to that script and say, like, this is the plan, we're going to focus with it and stay patient. And I think it's going to pay off. You may not see it right up front with sort of that dopamine hit level of traffic, but you're going to find that the people that you reach feel more meaningfully connected to what you're doing and more meaningfully connected to the democratic process. And that's fundamentally what we're about, right?
And for anyone listening that or watching that heard you say reverse town hall and is confused, can you talk a little bit more about what that is as a concept, but also how it went for you?
So a reverse town hall is an ingenious thing. We didn't invent it, right? It was something we encountered in the Advancing Democracy Fellowship, an idea that came out of that. And the proposition is pretty simple, is instead of taking candidates for office and sticking them on the stage and hearing what they have to say, you take voters and you put them on the stage and you invite the candidates to come and listen. And so, in theme with this question of what do young people or young professionals care about in Lafayette, we partnered with a local organization to do that. So we brought 5 or 6, I can't quite remember the exact number, but 5 or 6 speakers who represented different segments of that constituency. We put them on stage. We talked them through questions that were premised in that same set of survey results that we had been working on over the previous 6 or 7 months. And then we invited candidates for the local councils, for the local mayor's race, everything that was on the ballot to come in and listen to them talk. And it was great. I mean, we had, 100, 120 people show up. It was a really engaged thing. You kind of had everybody in the same room, and you were really able to sense that, these folks meaning the candidates were forced to consider some perspectives that they may not have had to yet, right? I'll say it was one of the most gratifying things we did last year. I mean, look, 100 people is a great number. It's not, obviously, in the context of 120,000 people in a city, like, it's not a majority, but like that sort of high touch thing of feeling like people got to know what the current is about in a very real way. They got to talk to candidates in a very real way. And you got to stick all this stuff in a live journalism event, I guess is the best way of thinking about it. I can't endorse the concept enough if you're willing to give it a shot. I mean, it's something that really felt like it paid off in terms of giving people access to, potentially their future leaders and making them feel like they were empowered to say something about what mattered to them.
Fantastic. And where can people learn more about the work you're doing?
Well, you can follow us at thecurrentla.com. We also have a pretty active Instagram page at thecurrentla. So if you're interested, or you can just sign up for our newsletters, which are free and can be hit. We'll hit your email inbox wherever you are.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us, Christiaan. And it's fantastic to talk to you.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.